Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book summarizing the history of politics from the very beginning up until pretty close to the modern day.
History of political thought.
Yes.
Not just history of politics, that would be...
Yes, sorry, that would be ridiculous. That'd be stupid of me. I'm so sorry. But yes, like you said, the history of political thought, and we are starting at the very beginning with Athenian democracy, starting with the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. This chapter, Chapter 1, is titled Why Herodotus? We kind of covered some of the topics covered in this chapter in the introductory chapter, kind of laying the foundations for things, but much more detail here, very historical. I know you were talking to me last night about how much you liked this chapter.
Yeah.
It was much easier to read than I thought it would be.
Yes.
Very historical, really taking it step by step. I like his writing style. I like it a lot.
Yeah, he's got a good way of narrating things, and summarizing. I don't know why. I don't know if you ever answered the question why Herodotus.
Yeah, I don't think you did either.
Thucydides, or both of them. I mean, he got to start somewhere.
Yes,
and so he starts with Herodotus, who is really kind of more of the father of history, I think. But I guess history is political commentary, and so he talks about that. It's the writings of Herodotus and Thucydides have their own particular bent and their own evaluation and their own ideals they kind of inject in their writings, which of course I guess all writers do to some extent. And we're getting back to that now, so that everybody has a bias, but loves to have the bias, whether it's right or wrong.
Absolutely. So he starts off talking about what we've inherited from the Greeks. He says, we've inherited very much from the Greeks. The words politics, democracy, aristocracy, and tyranny are direct borrowings, and a lot of the same political ideals of freedom, independence, and self-government we can kind of trace directly back to the Greeks. And the Greek political scene was centered around the polis, which was an unusual political form that was kind of always at risk of invasion and, kind of collapsing. And it flourished from around 600 BC to the time of Alexander the Great, around 322 BC. And so what the polis was essentially a grouping of city-states, and we'll talk about that a little bit more with the birth of the polis. But he goes on to say that Greek democracy is idolized by many today, but existed in a very different world. He said Athens at 431 BC contained about 50,000 adult male citizens, 200,000 free native inhabitants, and 300,000 inhabitants in all, including slaves, and it covered about half the area of Rhode Island. And a quarter of the citizens lived in the city, and the rest were in the countryside. So it was very different conditions. And I like his quote here on page 6. He says, if this is not as surprising as it seems at first sight, it should make for caution when reading newspaper editorials or listening to politicians and commentators demanding democracy and meaning many different things. So we kind of touched on that last week, but it is very true, I think, when we're looking at Athenian democracy. It's an entirely different world.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, even... Well, you look at the founding of our country, it's a very different world. When you look at urban versus agricultural or rural, but he doesn't really go into any depth about why the Athenian city-states were able to, or ended up having more different organizations with these little constitutional, almost like little republics, depending on how they formed, city-states all over this one particular area, as opposed to, why didn't this happen somewhere else? And I think one of the theories is that you had a combination of, they have great weather to grow things, but they had developed a society up to that point where you could have a relatively small farm and you'd be self-sufficient. And so then you can start thinking about these other things beyond just being able to feed your family, because you'd have the wheat crop, you'd have the olive for various other things, and what was the third thing that they always had?
I don't know.
The olive oil, the wheat, and there's a third thing. I'm completely escaping me now. Oh, the grapes.
Grapes, yes.
Yeah, for wine or whatnot. And you combine those three, and you have different growing seasons for those three different crops, and so you'd always be able to have a supply of food and those staples and all that.
Yeah, because it wasn't necessarily like that these city-states were necessarily more peaceful than the rest of the world, because they were always at war.
Yes.
It's just that they had such an organized society that like a certain group of people did not always have to fight in the war, right?
Well,
They always
that's
had the
true, too.
soldiers out there, but, you would have, peaceful farming life even in the midst of a war sometimes.
Well, I don't know that I agree with that because like especially the Spartans had their slaves. We're talking about Athenian democracy, but yeah, I guess you'd have a division of labor once you get to a certain affluence that you're able to have leaders that don't have to fight on the battlefield and all that. But I think there was a culmination of a lot of things. And I think part of what worked for a while was this independence they would be able to have from the state, and there's always this criticism that once the right to vote was expanded to everybody, not everybody, but to like it's the lower classes or whatever, and once the people realized they could just vote themselves to get stuff, that's where it becomes dangerous, and you see a temptation of that in modern America, even though it's a republic. People talk. I like that quote that you read because so many people talk about democracy and how we have to save our democracy. Well, we don't have a democracy. We have a republic with some democratic principles within it. But and I suspect that most of the politicians that go on and on about democracy know that. I suspect that there's several of them that don't.
Yeah, probably.
They don't understand what they're talking about.
He then goes on to say that Greek political thinking began in seeing the contrast between Greece and Persia. He says politics could only exist in the self-governing city-states and under the rule of law. So Persia had no politics, according to the Greeks, because the king was the master of slaves, not the ruler of citizens. So they saw, Persia as absent of politics entirely. He says this point was made by the Greek historian Herodotus. And so he, in one of Herodotus' works, he gives this conversation between the son of the Persian king Darius I, Xerxes, who was surprised that the Athenians would stand up to an army if they were free to do as they pleased. And so the exiled Spartan king Demaratus responds to him, and he says, "They are free, yes, but they are not wholly free, for they have a master, and that master is law, which they fear much more than your subjects fear you. Whatever this master commands they do, and his command never varies. It is never to retreat in battle, however great the odds, but always to remain in formation and to conquer or die. They were citizens, not subjects, and free men, not slaves. They were disciplined, but self-disciplined. Free men were not whipped into battle." So this is an interesting kind of bit of conversation there, because it would make sense, from these, ancient kings to look at this group of people like, well, you're free. Why are you fighting us?
Correct.
Why not just run away? Why not just avoid the war entirely?
Or surrender or whatever.
But the Spartan king Demaratus is like, well, they respect their country so much, essentially. They respect this rule of law and they want to stand up for it, and that's why they're standing up against you.
Yeah, part of it's cultural. If they were to not abide by the law, it's different than just trying to avoid the whip. Everybody to your left and your right would look down upon you if you were to run or flee because you're in it together, as opposed to nobody would blame you for run away from a tyrant.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan Ryan then goes on to say that political thought began in Athens because they were a trading people and could compare their contemporaries. And he kind of contrasts this to the Israelites of the Old Testament. He says, in the Old Testament, we do have a lot of history, but it's not necessarily political history. It doesn't describe the politics.
Right.
Because the Israelites did not care about their neighbors' governments. They cared about the fact that they did not worship Yahweh. So he says that they were a people of no politics under the direct government of God, and they only became political when God allowed them to choose a king. So I guess that's sort of his reasoning for why he's not really delving into, descriptions of the Old Testament, instead focusing on Herodotus and Thucydides here, because, there's really not that much politics itself contained in the Old Testament in a way.
Yeah, and they didn't. It seems like the ancient Greeks really wrote down a lot about their arguments about why and what should we do, and I think I mentioned in the last episode how many different constitutions they had. I don't know if any of them survived. I think a few of them did, or at least in bits and pieces, or at least references to other constitutions. I think Aristotle was compiling them, but maybe all his stuff was destroyed at some point. But I think they really got into it and formed groups in these city-states and these regions where they self-governed one way or the other.
Yeah.
As those groups, and you didn't have like a superpower that was subjugating them. So they had the ability to be independent, and of course, they battle with each other to a certain degree. But But I think that really helped out a lot too.
It does kind of raise like an interesting question. Like, would we even, question the authority of a king or something if every government around us was structured the same way? Right. It's like if we didn't have those counterexamples, would we even like think that another form of government could even exist? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why China can't stand having Taiwan right there, because it's showing that there's another system of government where you don't have to be a communist. You don't have to be part of the party, and there's freedom. And they just can't abide by that because it's a counterexample to their oppression. It's like, because people will be like, wait a second, they seem to be just as happy, if not happier than us, and none of them are communists. Why don't we do what they did? And why do I have to listen to you? That's just a dangerous thought for a totalitarian regime. Yeah,
he kind of mentions that a little bit later as to like why the Athenians, stood up to the Persians in the first Persian War. We'll get that in a little bit. He's like, it makes sense for the Persians to kind of quell all these rebellions, because then that spells, disaster for the rest of their empire. If they're seeing all these little pocket rebellions, then we should put an end to that, and the people would rise up and such.
Yeah, you got to give them an example. Make them an example, I guess.
He then goes on to talk about the birth of the polis. He says that the
origins... Is it polis or polis?
I say polis.
Very well.
He says that the origins of the polis are obscure, but there's two main theories. And the first theory is military. Scattered groups of people came to live behind protective walls, and then from there you have to kind of design this government and the city-state. And then the other theory is political, and a group of people agreed to live under one authority with or without a wall. And he says, for example, Sparta, they lived in villages without walls, but they were still one political entity, and they kind of prided themselves on the fact that they didn't have a wall, that each man essentially was a brick and defended the country themselves. He said that there is no uniform pattern of polis organization. So it's an interesting idea there. I mean, it seems like such a minor distinction, like, they just agreed to live together. But I mean, I guess that would have been a very big deal to have just isolated people, either under threat or under no external threat, just to agree to come together in such a way. I mean, it seems somewhat remarkable. You know what I mean?
I think it's natural.
You think it's natural?
I mean, you'd have, it's just like any other society. You have your family, your clan, and it's basically a series of clans that are in the same region.
Yeah.
Getting together, just to facilitate. But I think the trade and the affluence helped along, like money greased the wheels.
Because it's usually you just hear about like these types of things forming because of like outside threat. They had to get behind these walls to defend themselves. I guess it is. Yeah. The theory that it was just political, I think, is interesting.
Right. Yeah, and he also talks about like how the wealthy feared the poor, that they would ransack their overturn them because the wealthy are outnumbered, and the poor feared the rich, that they would subjugate them, and that's really what's been the unique characteristic of American society that people don't appreciate nowadays is the opportunity to go from very poor to very wealthy, or vice versa.
Yeah.
You could lose everything if your business goes under, you make some bad investments and all that. But there's that kind of ability to go from the lower classes to the upper classes. There's a poll. I don't know. Of course, polls are worthless to a certain degree, but there was a poll of a surprising number of people that are your age that their goal in life is to be an influencer. Because that'd be a great job.
Yeah.
Be an influencer. But that it opens up these opportunities in this new medium where you don't really have to, be part of the somebody else's structure or somebody else's business. You can kind of do your own thing, and I think that opportunity makes for a lasting, developing country because the poor won't resent, so much their temporary place in life. Thomas Sowell speaks a lot about that, about how people talk about, well, there's always, there's this percentage of people that's below poverty, and there's this percentage that's always above. But if you actually look at the statistics that's over time, there are percentages, but they're different people.
Yeah.
They'll go up or go down, or a lot of them go up, and I think that's a key issue for longevity of a republic or a democracy.
Because that's what he goes on to say here. He says, they were very divided by class, and class warfare was that constant threat. and then it kind of gave the ability for tyrants to seize power, usually the rich. He says this is, interestingly, a tyrant did not necessarily imply brutal or self-seeking, just that the person gathered power unconstitutionally and ruled solely sort of outside of the assembly or the government, which we'll talk about later. He says, one of the clearest examples of this were the Pisistratids, who were moderate, rational tyrants. It was a father and a group of sons who ruled Athens in the late 6th century BC, and they actually kind of helped to avert civil war by ruling sort of as these tyrants. But they were overthrown in 510 by an insurrection that was assisted by Sparta. So that's kind of the first concrete example of, these people were in charge at this time that we see in this book, at least.
Right.
So kind of the beginning of, these are the rulers at this time, this history of political thinking here.
Yeah, and it's I'm always amused by this thought of international law and how like one country can't invade another country. Like going back to the Gulf War, I was always confused by the Gulf War because it's like, wait a second, if the United States goes in and just illegally, so to speak, blows up Saddam Hussein and all his henchmen. What's really illegal about that? What right do they have to subjugate their own people? Even if we went in there just to conquer them, what's the difference between the local conquerors or some international conqueror? And people don't seem to even think about that. Well, it's against the rule of law. You can't invade a neighbor. Why not? Well, why are those people in power? If they're in power not through the choice of their own people, what difference does it make if we go in there and we become their tyrant?
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, I didn't think about that, did you?
No, I mean, it's just an interesting question.
If Mexico keeps becoming more and more corrupt in narco state, at some point, it's like, well, why are we just letting these drug lords run the show over there? Why don't we run it?
Yeah, so it's almost like people look at separate countries like an ant farm that you can't touch. It's like,
right.
Well, I mean, these couple of ants, overthrew the voice of the other ants, but I mean, it's their own ant farm. Who are we to have a say? And it's like, well, which ones,
Yeah,
worse,
why do they have a say? Why don't we have a say?
Yeah.
Why don't we just conquer them? What's the difference? There's no difference. There's no moral or legal difference. I mean, granted, you shouldn't go out and be a tyrant.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not a good thing to do, a smart thing to do. It's maybe it would be beneficial, but that's a lot different than saying you can't. Well, yeah, we can. But maybe we shouldn't. Yeah. But what's the difference between some local thug like North Korea, starving their own people? Why don't we just go over there and decapitate that regime? We run it.
Yeah.
What, is that worse? Well, it's not good to kill people, but I guess aside from that, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not good, but I don't think one is worse than the other.
And who was it that has the quote? I need to remember who it is, but it was a quote: "I'd rather be ruled by one tyrant than the mob."
I don't know.
Yeah, because if you have one person, they're more consistent because it's just one person making.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit later, I'm sure.
And then, right. And so when to think of having a benevolent tyrant or a benevolent monarch, it's possible. It's just as possible you'd have a terrible monarch.
Yeah. So then Alan Ryan goes in and he talks about exactly what Athenian democracy was and essentially how it functioned. And I thought this was very interesting because I knew very little about the actual government structure of Athens.
Yeah, right.
He says this tyranny was replaced with a radical democracy, which lasted for almost 2 centuries, almost uninterrupted. He says from 508 on, Athenian politics were dominated by Cleisthenes, who focused on military preparedness and keeping social peace by opening political life to the poorer citizens. So again, that sort of radical democracy that was very unique to this area. But still, there was this very sharp distinction between free and servile in Athens. There was no marriage between free and slaves. The foreigners could only become citizens through expensive specific legislation. There was citizenship by descent. You couldn't come over and become a citizen very easily. And that high-status women were veiled in public and were expected to stay home. So it's not like it was, this all-inclusive democracy for everybody. It was a very specific group of people who had access to the democracy, essentially.
Right, and that's a big difference between the Greeks and the Romans, because the Romans would allow for some sort of citizenship.
It wasn't, full citizenship. We talked about this last episode, but it was, you can become part of Rome. You can receive some of the benefits of being in Rome.
And that's one of the great things about our country is we allow, of course, everybody wants to be here and be an American, except for the people who are Americans. but if we have an ordered immigration system, we let people become citizens fully as if they were born here. So we don't have this aristocracy, the formal aristocracy. Like you see in ancient Greece.
So he goes on to say that the key to the democracy was the assembly. And the assembly was essentially a combination of what today we would call the legislature, judiciary, and executive. So
that just means it's the tyranny of the mob.
Yes,
because they have all the powers.
Yes.
They if you appeal the decision, you appeal to them.
Yeah, it says no appeal against its decisions except by a later meeting of itself. They had to appeal themselves.
Right.
It had a potential membership of 40,000, but it operated mostly through many smaller bodies, particularly through the 500 members of the governing council called the Boule, and the 30 members of the Praetorী, who were the managing committee of the Boule for a month at a time.
Yeah, 1 month at a time. Imagine the chaos. Having 30 people in charge for 1 month. My God.
It says that membership was chosen by lottery after careful scrutiny of eligibility of whose names were entered. So it was random to an extent.
Right.
It was random once your name was put in.
Correct.
But, it all depends on whose name is put in. And with the assembly having all of the power, the assembly decided whose names were put in.
Well, yeah, you have to be eligible for it. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
So he says that anyone could be accused of misusing public office and be dismissed by and from the assembly. So a lot of, just at whim, this is the power that you have. You can get kicked out if essentially the assembly doesn't agree.
Definitely want to be polite.
Yes,
too. You don't
probably.
want to be the biggest jerk in the room because they'll be like, let's get Adam out of here.
Yeah, and there were also
Who's in favor? I moved to ostracize Adam. Second, all in favor? Aye. Get out. That's it.
Pretty much. There were also no public prosecutors, so all cases had to be brought up by individuals. It says the system was wide open to abuse, but remained mostly effective, which is astounding because, we're listing all of these problems, very clear problems with this, but somehow it existed for almost 2 centuries.
Yeah, and they had a process. I was exaggerating, but you'd have a trial in front of this group, and so everybody knowing that they could be on the receiving end of such a decision, I would think would temper your enthusiasm to punish people because then you're the next one to be voted out. And I'm sure there was a lot of that as time went on, but yeah, at least there's a procedure to have your grievances aired by some sort of council of 30 or 500 or whatever the case may be.
So he goes on to say that Cleisthenes solved the worst problems of internal conflict by organizing the citizens into 10 tribes, which were geographical groupings who determined the political rights of their members. So each tribe supplied 50 members of the Boule, and nobody could serve longer than a year at a time, and eventually they passed a law that said that you cannot serve more than twice in a lifetime. So a maximum of 2 years, essentially, in the Boule. And so ordinary Athenians, he has this interesting section here where he says that ordinary Athenians had a good chance of being the equivalent of president of Athens for at least 1 day in a lifetime and a member of the cabinet for a month. This reflected the Athenian passion for equalizing the political influence of every citizen. What we moderns would have to do if we shared that passion with the same intensity is an intriguing question, but it is doubtful that we could keep many of our present political arrangements. Yeah, so it's very, it's very strange to us, just the fact that just anybody, literally anybody, had a good chance of just being essentially one of the few people with a lot of political power at any given time.
Right. Well, and, you have to keep in mind that the state was so much more limited than what the state is now.
That's true.
It was they made major decisions like war and building monuments and that type of thing. Those kind of improvements, but it was nothing like our current.
I guess it's not like Joe from down the street would be randomly selected to have the nuclear launch codes.
Correct. I mean, it would be similar to mayor of the city for a day. Because it's something that you still have. I think they had a professional class, a bureaucracy that would do the nuts and bolts, and then you have the leadership that's chosen from the assembly. So it's different, but it's also much smaller in scale, so it's more like a county government in our era almost. Because I'm trying to think of how many people that they had then, but the population was probably less than St. Louis County, I would think.
I think so.
St. Louis County is 1.2 million. So if you think about it, then what can you cycle through those people and. Yeah, I'm trying to think, what was the population? They said it
was 300,000, including slaves and non-citizens, but it was 50,000 adult male citizens, essentially at its height.
Right, so there's 230,000 in Jefferson County. So a much larger area, less populous, and a little bit more people, including the slaves and stuff.
He then goes on to describe how the 10 tribes also supplied the 10 generals. And these were elective positions, but could be dismissed by the assembly. So this is one of the places where you do have like actual elections and not just like a random lottery to be selected.
Right, right.
He says one of the most famous generals was Pericles, who served before and during the Peloponnesian War, and he had the authority of a modern president and was called a demagogue, and that he kind of manipulated, in a way, the desires of the people to remain in power for a good long while. And I like this quote here on page 13 as well about the power of the assembly. He says, nonetheless, the assembly's power was very real. It did not hesitate to dismiss Pericles or other generals, and sometimes did so in a fit of ill temper and regardless of merit. Its sovereignty was absolute, and its members knew it. The consequences were predictable. Unless the assembly was on its best behavior, it could be seduced by flatterers, bamboozled by crooks, and led by the nose by the glib and quick-witted. If it lost its temper, it could behave atrociously.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, is just, I think, a great quote, just explaining, they could essentially do whatever they wanted.
Right.
Which is a scary amount of power, especially for an ancient city-state.
Right. You didn't have like a Bill of Rights that said, okay, there's some things that they can't touch.
Yeah.
That everybody has these individual rights that's not something that they would have respected or understood. And they made a lot of horrible decisions, but it seemed to work to a certain degree for a long period of time.
Yes. So then he goes on, and he talks for a long while about the glories and failures of democracy, and this is all kind of centered around the Peloponnesian Wars. So he says the 5th century was dominated by the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. This was called out the talents of the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. And so both Herodotus and Thucydides were very critical of democracy.
Yeah.
He says that Herodotus was the chronicler of the Persian War, and he was impressed by the Persian monarchy, and he kind of leaves the reader impressed that the Athenians found the coherence to defeat the Persians. Thucydides was the chronicler of the Peloponnesian War, and he leaves the reader unsurprised that the Athenian assembly could be so destructive. So essentially, they both have similar messages, but the Persian War essentially ends in a victory for Athens, and it's a surprise. But then the Peloponnesian War ends in a pretty big failure for Athens, and that is not so much of a surprise.
Yeah, they got wiped out. Yeah, by the Spartans. So and Thucydides, I'm no expert on Thucydides, but I do believe that his main thing was he was writing the stories because human nature doesn't change over time. So these are what happened there could be a lesson to anybody anywhere in the future of what humans will do under certain circumstances. And anybody who's a cynic about human nature is not going to believe that unfettered democracy is a good idea, because you're going to have that idea. Well, if you get a group of people together, they're going to make really bad decisions from time to time, and if you don't have some sort of check on it, which of course he would like the aristocracy because they would be better or whatever, his theory would be certainly more educated because they'd have the affluence to have that education, would be better suited to make those decisions. So they anyway, so I'm not saying that's the truth, but that's I'm sure what his position would be.
Yeah, he then goes on to describe what the Persian War actually was. He says it began with the revolt of Greek cities under Persian rule in Asia Minor in 500. And Athens sent 20 triremes to help, but the rebellion was snuffed out in 494, and the Athenians soon realized that they had acquired a dangerous enemy. In 491, the Persians demanded signs of submission from the mainland cities, and many submitted. I'm going to read here from the book because I liked this distinction between Athens and Sparta. He says, Athens and Sparta not only stood firm, but murdered the Persian ambassadors. The Athenians put them on trial and killed both the ambassadors and their translator for offenses against the Greek language. The Spartans simply threw them down a well. So a nice distinction there. They both accomplished the same things, but the Spartans were a little more direct about it.
Yeah, I wonder what the crimes against the Greek language was.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess they had a very bad translator.
As somebody who studies linguistics, you have to keep that in mind.
I'd be interested to see what actually happened there.
Maybe what they were saying was such an affront.
You should not even be using the Greek language to say this.
To say those things, yeah.
Like the Spartans were going to throw you down a well. So the Persian king Darius then invaded in 490, but the Athenians successfully defended at Marathon without Spartan aid. And this showed the military might of the Athenians, and they began to aspire to become an imperial power. So Darius' son Xerxes invaded in 480, and he was delayed by 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and several hundred Thebans and others to give the Greeks the time to escape to more favorable positions. That's, of course, the Battle of Thermopylae, the story of the movie 300. So this was a triumph for Spartan values, but it was a military defeat. The Persians could now march straight to Athens. So the Athenian leader Themistocles persuaded the Athenians to leave the city, and he sent a message to the Persian fleet that he would change sides, but then led their ships into the Straits of Salamis in September 480, where they were destroyed. So Xerxes then left his general Mardonius to finish off the Greeks, but Mardonius was killed in 479 by the Spartan-led Greeks, and this ended the serious threat of invasion. He goes on to say that there were some minor battles for the next 20 years, but Athens was not in any more of a threat from this point on.
Yeah, not from a direct invasion.
Yes, not from a direct invasion of Persia, yes.
Yeah. It really is amazing that they were able to hold off the Persians. You know, if you study it a little bit, which I have a little, they have these crazy numbers. You know, they claim there's these 100,000 troops. When you look at the numbers, it just doesn't make sense. It's like maybe the translation, or maybe just the exaggeration of a historical account. Well, he does mention
that, Herodotus is also called the father of lies. He was very susceptible to just believe any story that was told to him and then regurgitate it. So
write it down.
But we're at that distinction where it is kind of becoming, where's the line between, myth and history? Because you look at like the Iliad, which was composed about 300 years before this, which tells a true enough story about the invasion of Troy. We do believe that these things happened, but of course it's almost entirely fantastical in like the events that are actually told there.
Well, I'll make a comment about even something local that became national and international, which is the Michael Brown shooting. The hands up, don't shoot is a myth. I mean, it's completely false. The guy never had his hands up. So, and that's something that's heavily documented, and there's sworn testimony that it's false, but it's a myth that I'd say a majority of the American public believes. Yeah. And it's just an example of one particular crime story. Yeah. But if you look at so even now with our modern communications, modern language, literacy, how a story like that can get so wrong is the exact opposite of what happened. You could understand how in ancient times that some facts and figures would be mistaken or exaggerated or whatever.
I mean, I guess it's almost part of human nature then. You're going to exaggerate anything to really kind of make your point in a way.
Right. People want to believe what they want to believe to a certain degree too. Mm-hmm. True. And if you have people that are not honest about telling the story, like Michael Brown's buddy who was a convicted liar at the time, and then the historians, which in our case would be the contemporary writers of news, just ran with a false story and failed to correct it.
Yeah. So for the next 75 years after the Persian War, we saw the rise and fall of radical Athenian democracy. As Athens was now the dominant maritime power, they formed the Delian League, which was sort of a scam, I guess. They were all of the members essentially became tributary states to Athens. It's
not a scam. They've basically became subjects.
Yes, but it's formed, in the idea that this is a league. We're an alliance, but it essentially became tributary states.
Well, it's a protection racket.
Yes, that's true.
You better pay us some money, or else those Persians are going to come knocking on your door.
So at this point, the only check on Athens was their own self-interest. Neither Sparta nor their tributary states stood up to them. So even though more power was put in the assembly's hands, no checks were placed on them. The Constitution still placed absolute power in the hands of the people. So they're expanding, they're getting all these tributary states, but nothing is being done to say, hey, maybe we should have somebody who kind of looks over the assembly. But that does not happen, not at this moment. So let me move on to Thucydides and his history. So in fourth,
you want to talk about ostricism at the time?
Sure, you could talk about ostracism.
It was a kind of an aside, but it's an important part of their system where anybody
big birds in Africa, big long necks.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Big eggs.
Big eggs.
They had a system where you could be ostracized by a vote of the assembly and be banned from the country for some period of time. And they ostracized. How do you say that guy's name? Aristides. He was a leading statesman and hero of the Battle of Salamis, and they ended up ostracizing him. And who was it? Do we get to the point in the book where they talk about how they sent the triremes?
Not yet. Okay. That's in the Peloponnesian War.
I love that story. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes.
We'll go on to
But did you mention why Aristides was was
I think they just didn't like it. Well, they thought he was getting too big for his britches, basically.
Well, he was approached by one particular guy who didn't know that he was Aristides and asked how to spell Aristides' name.
So he could put in the ballot to have him ostracized.
Yes, and the reason why was because he didn't even know Aristides. He just heard too much that he was just. Yeah. It's like, well, this guy's too good to be true. Get out.
Yes, I kind of respect that.
Yeah, I think that's great.
A true cynic.
Yes.
An illiterate cynic.
So in 431, a war broke out between Athens and its allies against an alliance led by Corinth and Sparta. And so this should have been a quick victory for Corinth and Sparta because they were much bigger military powers, but the Athens held out for 27 years. This Peloponnesian War lasted for 27 years. So Thucydides chronicled the Peloponnesian War, and he wrote it as a commentary on the shortcomings of democracy. So Thucydides was an aristocrat and a general who was exiled by the assembly in 424 due to a military loss.
He might have had an axe to grind.
Yeah, I think so. But he could kind of see the war from both sides. He was not an Athenian. He was not a Spartan.
He was not directly involved, but he knew the players.
Yes.
Yeah.
But of course, he did have that axe to grind. He was not much in favor of Athens. And so there are three major parts to his history, and we'll talk about these in more detail. The first was Pericles' funeral oration. The second was the Athenian massacre and enslavement of the inhabitants of Melos. And the third was the disastrous expedition against Syracuse. Mm-hmm. So he thought that the aggressiveness of democracies was universal. And so this is what you were mentioning earlier. I'm going to read from the book. He says, he told his readers that he had written his history forever. Human nature was the same at all times and places, and the political passions and ambitions of mankind were ineradicable. So any persons concerned with the politics of their own time could read Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War and derive instruction. And, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there, because we are still reading about the Peloponnesian War. We are still reading about Thucydides. It is still relevant today.
Well, you see that it's a kind of a conflict between two different systems. Mm-hmm. One a very militarized, tightly structured society, Sparta against this democracy, which was much more dynamic, but all dynamic in very good ways and dynamic in very horrible ways. It ended up basically causing their own defeat by making some poor decisions and beating Syracuse and just overextending themselves. It doesn't make any sense.
And so the first major part was Pericles' funeral oration. And the way that Thucydides wrote his histories was at some points he had direct quotes of things, but at other points he kind of just put words into people's mouths at what he thought was said or what he thought should have been said. So we're not sure, what's exactly true fact here, but it's at least based on true accounts of history here.
I think Thucydides should be considered like the first modern journalist. Because that's what they do now.
I think the mayor should have said this. Yes. This is what I'm going to put in the paper.
Yeah, only if I like the mayor.
Yes,
well, this is what he would have said because he's a jerk.
Yes. And so one of the first things that he mentions about Pericles' funeral oration is that it features a common rhetoric to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Yeah. So it defends the ethos of democratic society. It insists that words cannot enhance the glory of the dead for their deeds speak for themselves. It praises the country's founders. It praises the society and polity for which they died. And it also expresses grief at the loss and the fact that grief must not undermine the determination that the unique polity in its way of life must survive. So it's saying, we had a failure here. We had a major loss, but we need to keep this way of living alive. These people died for this. We need to keep it alive.
Right. And Gettysburg was technically a victory, but it was a painful victory. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he says, at this time, Pericles' Athenians were in a bad state. He had persuaded them to abandon the countryside and shelter in the city away from the destruction of the Spartans. They're essentially all huddled in Athens. Their fields are at risk of being burned and everything like that. And he says that Pericles' speech differed from the normal funeral speech. He unconventionally praises the city for which the soldiers died. He praises its democracy for its interest in the many, not the few. He praises it for its equal rights, and he praises it for the virtues of appointment by merit, not status. So those are kind of the key features that he wants to describe here in this speech. It's still a good system. It's interesting that he put this in a funeral speech. So he emphasized the free and open society and participatory politics. He says, we do not say that a man who takes no notice of politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he has no business here at all. Yeah. So this is kind of what we were talking about last time with the participatory politics, this idea that everybody needs to vote. And this was definitely upheld by the Athenians. If you have no business in politics, you have no business here at all. You're not just minding your own business. You have to be involved.
Right. Yeah, and I don't subscribe to that.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people don't even want to have anything to do with politics, and they just want to be able to select people that will take care of it for them.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I think, the best way to do it.
Yeah.
And if the people take care of it, then all is good. It's like you know, and I know this from local government. You know you're screwing up if there's a whole ton of people showing up to your meetings. Because you made some sort of mistake. You've gone a little too far afield because the whole crowd. There's a bunch of angry people at you because you did something stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're complaining that that nobody shows up to our meetings, you're usually doing it right.
Yeah.
Because the people will still read news stories or whatever you put on social media, and they can see what's
people
happening.
only show up and want to participate when they see something that's going wrong.
They
usually.
They have better things to do with their time.
Yes.
And I respect that. But that's how people make mistakes, though, because they get carried away. They're like, well, nobody will know. Come on, they'll find out sooner or later, and then there'll be a mob here. But that's a different problem.
So then Pericles then praised Athenian valor in war, but he kind of says that their fame is bound up in the military expansion that they had provoked, and this is what essentially provided the conflict of their death. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword here, where Thucydides is saying, well, he praises this valor, but at the same time, this sort of valor was what caused their death, this greatness of the country. He then ends the speech, or he ends his comments here with a more unfortunate point. He says that he told the women that they should mourn the dead heroes, but that is the limit of their public role.
Well, it's important to know your place.
Yeah. Cry for us, but then go back home.
Well, it's a different society.
Yeah.
And we mentioned this. I mentioned this in previous seasons. I wonder how many geniuses, how many wonderful things that the human race could have benefited from if we had more participation from women, but we didn't. So just have to move on.
Yes,
it's important to know, though, it was a limited democracy. It wasn't everybody. It was, like you said, it was limited to certain men, and it was inherited, and certainly not the slaves or them damn foreigners. According to the Greeks.
According to the Greeks. That's a direct quote from a Greek that you knew personally.
That's right.
So then he moves on. He talks about the Melian dialogue. So this is the second of the third important points here. He says, in 416, the Athenians demanded that the Melians surrender their city and pay tribute to the war effort. But the Melians claimed the right to remain neutral, so Athens killed every adult man and sold all the women and children into slavery, effectively ending the city of Melos for good.
Yeah, they did, because then they put, I think, a bunch of Athenian colonists, essentially.
Yeah, which is
hey,
crazy.
Who wants to live in this almost new house?
Yeah, it's nobody's lived here right now. Yeah,
nobody's lived here for 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's empty, guys. It's a great place.
That's what happened, man. Back in the day, people went to war. They conquered, and they gave these guys a chance to join the team, and they said no. And the dialogue is between trying to appeal to their sense of honor and justice, and that didn't work.
Yeah.
That's pretty horrible. He laid siege to him. I think he starved him out, and then when he finally surrendered, he killed all the men and put everybody else in slavery.
And Alan Ryan says, this is a story that you like. This was very reminiscent of the events at Mytilene at the beginning of the war in 427. The assembly sent a fleet to tell the soldiers to kill the adult men and enslave the women and children at that city, but they soon changed their minds and sent a second fleet to countermand their previous instructions. But in this case, at Melos, the Athenians did not have second thoughts. No second fleet was sent.
Yes. The first fleet thankfully went slow.
Yeah, because they were like, well, we're not too excited about this. And the second fleet overtook them and gave the correct or the revised command.
Isn't that crazy?
Was,
that all those people would have been slaughtered and sold into slavery if they hadn't gotten to their senses the next day and send the next boats out to stop the first boat.
Yeah. He says that the dialogue is essentially a debate between the Athenians and the Melians. The Melians have a couple points like, no, you shouldn't do this. Sparta will come to our aid, or it'll make you look bad on the world stage. But the Athenians basically just shrug all this off. They're like, well, we're too powerful at this point. Sparta's not going to come all the way out here and help this tiny city.
Right.
And so it's like, this attitude that, we're untouchable in this sort of circumstance.
Well, it's kind of like, don't make me come in there. Don't make me go upstairs and bring you down to dinner. You won't like, or what was it? Chris Rock's, maybe I shouldn't quote that, but like Chris Rock's bit where he says, you know, if the police have to chase you, they're bringing an ass whooping with them. Not anymore, but that was back in the day, and that's pretty much, you know, what they believed, you know, and I'm not making excuses for them, but you know, they have that was just considered the natural way of things. The strong did what they wanted to, and the weak had to do what they were told.
Yeah. And that's what Alan Ryan says is the crux of the Athenian argument. He says, the crux is thus the patent injustice of the Athenian attempt on the independence of a small and helpless power. The Athenian view has been described. It is the law of nature that the strong do what they can, and that the weak do what they must. He says it was an event that should give pause to anyone who supposes that democracies are by their nature peace-loving, humane, and just. Their capacity for mass murder should not be underestimated.
Agreed.
That's absolutely true. Just because, you know, a lot of people have a say in things does not mean that their say will always be correct.
Correct. Boy, that's the truth. Power of the mob, man. It's a dangerous thing. It can be great, but it's probably more often wrong. You know, 'cause it's just you don't have any guardrails.
Yeah.
And you get whipped up, you know, and anybody in a group or in a crowd, you know, they're all going one direction. It's hard to say no.
Especially when you're in a position where the crowd can kick you off the body entirely.
Yeah.
Right? At a whim, essentially.
Right. Kick you out of the country.
Yeah.
I mean, they could just say, get out.
Yeah.
Get out of the country. Then you're on your own, man.
So we move into the third part of Thucydides' histories, which is Alcibiades and the Sicilian disasters. This is essentially the downfall of Athens, the end of the Peloponnesian War. He says, after the death of Pericles, politics became very unstable. So we have a couple key players here, in particular Nicias, who in 420 essentially provided a 5-year truce in the Peloponnesian War in which both sides attempted to reinforce their positions. And so because of this, an Athenian expedition to Sicily was then commenced between 415 and 413, in which some leaders wanted to launch an all-out invasion of Sicily to weaken the ability of Spartan colonies there. They were both essentially going after Sicily. Some of the Greeks wanted to conquer it, but Alcibiades, the ward of Pericles, kind of, you know, his essentially inherited some of his power, at least, you know, by name, was opposed to this, and he hoped to recruit the Sicilians as allies. But when they arrived at Sicily, they found an alliance against Athens. So immense resources were devoted to the expedition, essentially to conquer Sicily and make them their subjects. So Alcibiades was then charged with blasphemy by the assembly for the destruction of sacred statues, and hearing that he was sentenced to death, he deserted to the Spartans, leading to the crushing defeat of the Sicilian expedition. So Athens was then further devastated by the Spartan army, which had the advice and help of Alcibiades for a good long while. And in 411, there was a short-lived attempt to institute an oligarchy, but then democracy was restored and Alcibiades was recalled. And so after some later small-scale Athenian victories, the Spartans twice offered peace, but the Athenians denied it both times. So then after these both denials of these peace offerings, the Spartans and the Persians finally formed an alliance, and the Athenian fleet was defeated and the city besieged. And in 404, the Athenians capitulated, leading to the destruction of Athens' walls, the reduction of their fleet to 12 ships, and the installation of the oligarchy of the 30 tyrants. And so then he kind of wraps up this section by saying that the Peloponnesian War shows two things. First, that Athenian democracy was both resourceful, patriotic, energetic, and determined, while being fickle, cruel, and prone to deception. And secondly, that the one major reason for the failure of Greek city-states overall was that they were conscious of being both Greek and a narrower ethnicity, and so could never fully unite. He says, you know, it's obvious to us now that if all these city-states had just come together under one banner, you know, they would have taken care of the Persians, they would have, you know, helped quell any sort of dissent because, you know, we're all part of the same thing, we can devote resources to this, you know, insurgency. But at the end of the day, they couldn't get past that. They were so drawn into their own individual city-state. You know, I'm a Greek, but I'm also a Spartan. I'm also a Melian, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we can't ally with you. It's kind of a, you know, an unfortunate thought. You know, we would have had much greater success if they had united.
Well, I mean, and the same problems exist in America. I mean, there's not a problem that we couldn't solve if we all got together and chose the right path. And of course, you have to choose the right path. And what is the right path? But you know, like our immigration system, it's super easy to fix. And they said, well, there's 20 million illegal immigrants in here, or they don't call them illegal immigrants. You can't remove them all. Well, if we really wanted to, we could. Yeah. You know, I mean, we can move a lot of freight around this country. You know, we can barcode these people. We can, you know, we can get them out if we wanted to. I'm not saying that we should.
Yes.
I'm not saying we should barcode any people. But there it seems so obvious from the outside. Hey, you guys should just unite against these outside forces. But when you're making an individual decision, and you also have people that are offering bribes or whatever, or a better deal to not be part of this unit, it makes a certain amount of sense. And just like in how people argue about a whole bunch of different things in America today, it makes a lot of sense when you're in the middle of it. But on the outside, you're like, why didn't you just all just do the right thing?
Yeah, I think like another point you could make from this, like even if we're not uniting the city-states and that sort of stuff, is that Athenian democracy was most successful when there was like one dominant voice in charge. When we saw Pericles, he was able to make consistent decisions and stuff like that. When there was one dominant voice, you could help, make reform and better things. But then as soon as Pericles died, we immediately had all these warring factions who all had these wildly different ideas. And they essentially, tried to come at the problem with too many angles and ended up, losing it entirely. Because, Alan Ryan says in here, if they had just gathered their resources and invaded Sicily the first time, they would have won. They would have conquered Sicily.
Yeah.
But instead, they second-guessed themselves. They had too much dissent amongst themselves, and then that just expended more resources and made it last longer, and they lost.
If I remember correctly, I think Sicily, of course, became aware of the impending potential invasion.
Yeah.
And I think this would have been after they murdered all the people in
Melos.
In Melos. And so the logical thing for them to do would either be one, form an alliance with with Athens, or have an alliance with Sparta just out of self-defense. And I think that's basically what
they at least allied, whatever city-states were on the island, allied with themselves against the Athenians. I'm not sure if they ended up allying with Sparta.
I think Sparta helped them out, didn't they?
I think so. I know that Sparta had colonies there. Yeah. I'm not sure to what extent they played, but I think Sparta did end up helping them out.
Right.
Yes.
It's a good book. It's been a long time since I read it. Is A War Like No Other by Victor Davis Hanson, which is a history of the Peloponnesian War.
Oh, interesting.
It's fascinating. If you ever get a chance, you should check it out.
It
might be in your library at school.
Probably is.
Although he is a pro-Trump political.
It might have been in the library at one point. It's no longer there.
Yeah, could
possibly.
So I should buy a copy and have you just put it on a shelf somewhere. We'll get the right number on it and put it in the right spot. We'll buy it for the library. Okay. I can't check out this book. There's no barcode.
So then he ends off this chapter with the trial of Socrates, kind of the last demonstration here of Athenian democracy. He
not a good demonstration.
Yeah, no. He kind of describes the 30 tyrants for a little bit, in that they deprived all but about 500 citizens of any say in politics, allowed only the 5,000 wealthiest to be tried by jury, and murdered numerous opponents without a trial. So essentially after the collapse of the democracy, they had this oligarchy of these 30 dudes who did whatever they wanted.
Right.
But he says it lasted barely a year before being overthrown by a Democrat in General Thrasybulus, and democracy was restored in 403 with a restricted franchise and reduced powers of the assembly, which is probably something that should have been done quite a while ago. And Thrasybulus even refused to execute the oligarchs and allowed them to choose to stay in the city or leave unbothered, which is interesting. He was given, an olive crown for that. He's all these terrible people who did atrocities for over a year, but he essentially pardons them for the sake of, not creating more strife.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like the Civil War.
Yeah.
You have to make a decision. You're either going to wipe them out, or you're going to reconcile with them.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you just create unmanageable problems for yourself. If you're trying to move forward. It's just like South Africa. After apartheid dropped, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which did not prosecute the crimes, but made them talk about it under oath and document it so that everybody knew what happened.
Interesting.
You should read about that.
Yeah, I've never read about that.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
No.
Yeah, it was brilliant. It was brilliant, and it worked for a long time. I don't know what their society is like now, but it was.
I mean, it reminds me almost exactly of what you were talking about last night about pardoning Trump. Almost, yeah.
Right. I mean, I don't think it's really going to happen, but I think Biden should do that. Yeah. So similar type of thing. You gotta unite the country somehow, and you gotta get your own supporters' bloodlust under control. You gotta say, okay, wait a second. what are we trying to achieve here? Just kind of like we were talking about, you got to unite for the problems that you have. And there are some significant problems in our country that are going to really develop over the next year economically with the food, the fuel and all that stuff. And you gotta come together, and a good idea would be for Biden to pardon Trump, just unilaterally pardon him, pardon him for all crimes. Yeah. Period. And he served our country for 4 years. We wish him well, and whatever he does, hopefully, like this from Biden's perspective, hopefully not running for president again. Maybe we'll get some new blood in here. I mean, he's old, I'm old. Let me serve out this term. He can enjoy his retirement. Yeah.
In a perfect world, that would happen. But instead, Biden gave a speech the other night surrounded by red floodlights and soldiers behind him. Again, demonizing Republicans as fascists.
Right. Well, only MAGA Republicans.
Only MAGA Republicans.
Which is like all of the Republicans.
Yes, at this point,
only the Republican voters. There's a lot of Washington insiders that call themselves Republicans. Those are good guys. Yeah. But all the voters, Anyway, yes. So, that's what's sidetracking.
Yes, that was a little bit of a rant. But going back to the book, he says, one of the first acts of the restored democracy was the trial of Socrates. Yeah. And Socrates was condemned to death in 399 on a charge of impiety. The essence of the charge was that he had denied that the gods existed and had corrupted the young. Socrates was in fact strikingly but unconventionally pious. Since he wrote nothing and disapproved of writing, we have only his memorialist's accounts to go on, however. He appears to have claimed that the gods could not be as human beings depicted them. The gods were all wise and all-knowing, but the poets depicted them as adulterous, murderous, quick to anger and slow to forgive, vain, sentimental, and foolish. So this was a big deal because I mentioned earlier, the Iliad, which features the gods heavily, and this is essentially one of the closest things to like a holy book. This describes the actions of the gods, and they do some terrible stuff. They're on both sides of the Trojan War, and constantly going against each other. And for Socrates to kind of say, well, if they are good, then they can't be like this. This is not how the gods are, which absolutely would,
Which always, I never quite could understand why they worship the gods that were so vindictive and vain and petty. I viewed the myth tales as really commentary on human nature and sin and all that stuff, because they have the same foibles that we have, the same character flaws that we have. And they're different archetypes, I guess you'd say.
I think they did almost treat the gods in that way, because it's like we have to appease them. What would I want if I was an angry, vindictive person? Right. I would want people to offer to me, and I would want people to worship me. And I think that's kind of the reason why. We have to appease the gods. We have to make them not angry at us, but angry at our enemies. We have to do the right thing at the right time.
I guess there just weren't as many. I guess maybe there just aren't as many people that would be like, if that's the god, then I'm going to give him a big middle finger. Yeah.
I don't think there were.
That would be my temptation. Yeah. Like I still can't get past the story of Abraham and God wanting him to sacrifice his son. I just can't get past that. Somebody's gonna have to help me with that one. But anyway, on to another. That's it. That's
another.
3 seasons ago.
That's 3 seasons ago at this point. And so he says, interestingly, the assembly had passed new laws against blasphemy during the Peloponnesian War. And the same laws that sentenced both Socrates and Alcibiades were passed by the assembly at this time. So I never knew this. I never even really knew much about Alcibiades. But it is interesting that there is a connection there. Both the same laws essentially sentenced both of these guys to death. Right. Of course, Alcibiades was later forgiven and brought back, and after he betrayed them to Sparta. But that was a whole other. Yeah,
it's like, oh, okay. Well, we're even.
Yeah, I guess he must have been a good general. I guess they really needed him back.
Right.
And so Socrates' friendship with the opponents of democracy had alienated his fellow citizens, but they did not intend for him to die. And this is an interesting bit here. He says, at his trial, he was offered the chance to stop teaching, but would not take it. He had the chance to propose a lesser penalty than death in his speech in his own defense, but he provoked the jury by asking for a reward for helping them to live virtuously. His view, as he explained, was that the only harm the jury could do a good man was to make him less virtuous, and merely dying would not diminish his virtue. In any event, he was an old man, and dying sooner rather than later was, if anything, a blessing. It is unsurprising that he was convicted of blasphemy by a narrow majority of the 500-man jury, but sentenced to death by a much larger margin. I just thought that was funny. Not as many convicted him for the crime as many as just convicted him to death, sentenced him to death, which is interesting.
Yeah, so sometimes the penalty phase is much easier than the guilt phase, because once you have the guilt phase done, it's like, oh, well, he's guilty. Let's stick it to him.
Yeah, interesting.
And especially if he's already said he consented to the punishment, essentially. I mean, you could wrestle with whether or not he was impious because he was saying, well, the gods are great. They're greater than what you understand. But of course it goes against their teaching. So in a way, he probably made a very compelling case, if not a little bit insulting to everybody there. He just kind of thumbed his nose at him, but it's the mob. So they just, they got together. Yeah, it's death.
Yeah. And it's interesting. He had a good response here. Alan Ryan says, he says it was worse for him to drink the laws by which he had been sheltered all his life than to drink hemlock and die. So he says, I was raised under these laws.
Worse for him to break the laws.
Yes, he was raised under these laws. He's not going to break them. This is what the democracy wants, and so be it. And he drank hemlock and died. And he ends this chapter by saying, he left behind questions that have puzzled mankind ever since, and a pupil of genius who pursued a vendetta against Athenian democracy and perhaps against all possible politics. That was Plato. So a little bit of a premonition of the next chapter, which is Plato and anti-politics. But I really like this chapter.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? Why Herodotus? Do you want to try to answer that question? Because I don't know if he ever did describe explicitly why Herodotus.
Well, I guess, I think he kind of did in that Herodotus had a history of the political developments with his own spin on them. And so it wasn't necessarily giving a thesis of Athenian democracy or political thought, but in a way implied that. And how he told the story and the meaningfulness of it. But I think Thucydides did that maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, but I mean, Herodotus was, I guess, the first.
I guess,
usually. So I mean, I guess it's that distinction between
first in time, first in right.
I mean, there were historians. I don't know how many there were at the time, but at least none.
I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, there would have been other historians, but I guess Herodotus is seen as the first who didn't just here's the facts. He also said, here's some commentary on them. Here's why. Here's the spin that I'm putting on things. It's the beginning of political thought.
Right. But it's true. It's like for the modern. This is part of the reason why I stopped studying philosophy is because it's like I don't know there's any original ideas.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of these same arguments we're having now over the right of a group of people to decide things have been debated since ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago.
Since Herodotus.
Why shouldn't we all decide? And then other people are like, well, why shouldn't the people who own stuff decide about what we're going to do with the stuff?
Yeah.
What about who's paying the taxes? Who's paying the bills? Why wouldn't they have a say in it? And the people that are more populist are like, well, we're all in this together. It's our country. So, I mean, it's the same arguments we're having now.
Yeah.
And then what's the proper structure? Do we want to have complete democracy where everybody gets an equal say? Or a representative democracy, or why do we have a Second Amendment that restricts our ability to keep these guns out of our society? Why is that even a thing? If 60% of us, which is not true, but let's say 60% of the people want to get rid of guns, why can't that 60% just get rid of it? Well, because we have an amendment that says you can under any circumstances, and for whatever reason. And the same thing with the First Amendment. Why are we allowing these people to lie?
Yeah.
We should just be value truth, and so if we had just an assembly, and we have 51% of the people say we're banning that lie, then we're not going to be able to say that, or else we'll be ostracized or imprisoned. Or
it is interesting to think about what would happen if our society was modeled after the assembly. And it's like, well, it's hard to think about because it's so drastically different today based on what would have happened, 100 years ago.
It wouldn't last.
Yeah, it wouldn't last for sure.
Last.
But it's like, because it changes so much, it changes on a whim. It's, whatever the majority wants at this given time is going to happen. You got to wait until the majority changes its mind if it's a bad ruling.
It's really the modern version, the closest modern version would be immediately after the French Revolution, where you had assemblies.
Yeah.
And boy, that didn't end well for anybody. I mean, they were killing people left and right. They started killing each other. And it wasn't until the Thermidor, the French Revolution is very similar to the current revolutionaries because they were changing language. They were changing. They changed the calendar, like the Thermidor counter-revolution that killed what's his face, Robespierre. It was called Thermidor because that was the time of the month. That was the month they called it Thermidor. I can't remember why, but they changed the names of the month.
Yeah,
and they had a 10-day week, I think. because they want to have reason as our God and all this other nonsense, and it ended up being very brutal. So I think that was probably the closest.
Yeah,
because they had an assembly. Post revolution, they had an assembly, and it was a mob, and then they got paid to attend the assembly. So they would go and they get paid. Everybody get a certain amount of money for attending the assembly because they wanted participation. It made sense intellectually, but then all you're doing is paying people that didn't have a job otherwise or otherwise occupied, and this is like their full-time job, which is kind of what we're doing with Congress now.
Yeah,
it's
no
like
kidding.
who takes that job? And we kind of got in that problem now where it's like nobody who is worth having the position, those are the only people that are willing to run for it.
Yeah.
Because of the costs associated with it and the defamation. Why bother with it? If you're worth anything, you don't run for a big office. I mean, unless you're crazy.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it just doesn't. It can't last.
Yeah. I mean,
it's amazing. It lasted 200 years in
Yeah.
ancient Greece, but it was a small country, mostly agrarian, and it wasn't a true democracy because there was only a certain amount of people that had a vote. It was limited.
Yeah.
And so it's not a true democracy, even though it was more than that than anything else that has been attempted.
Yeah.
Because the structure, as far as who the citizens are, once you establish who the citizens are, which are the men, essentially, native-born men, everybody had a vote, and it eventually devolves into a lot of bad decisions.
Yeah.
A lot of good, a lot of bad, but the bad are catastrophic.
Yeah, I think it's definitely more important that we take a lot of like the Greek values that he kind of mentions at the beginning. The freedom, the self-government, that sort of stuff. Definitely not their model of government.
Correct.
Because it's like all these people like, well, we need democracy, we need this, and it's like it barely worked for the Greeks for 200 years.
Right.
We've lasted longer than the Greek democracy did, and
it was a homogeneous society too. Don't forget that. I mean, it's a lot easier to have.
Wait, did you say homogeneous?
What did I say?
Homogeneous. Homogeneous, yes.
That's how I read it.
Homogeneous, yes.
Yeah. Homogeneous society, but because if you're all kind of inclined to make the same decisions anyway, you can equalize the input from everybody. But once you have a lot of cast of characters, it's 300-something million people in various states that are. I mean, you have different climates for crying out loud where some people live, and it just doesn't work on a scale this large and with a people that is so diverse, both in their education and their experience and their values. You have to have a system to moderate that and to regulate it, but also allow the accountability.
Yeah,
I don't know anything better than a federal system of a republic. But
so it's like we still have the freedoms that the Greeks did essentially. Like
we have more.
We have more
We
freedoms.
have the Bill of Rights. That's the key that people miss. The British miss it. The Canadians don't understand it. Nobody else in the world understands why the Bill of Rights was so important, and it's so weird to me that they didn't include it in the Constitution. Those were the first amendments. Yeah. To the Constitution. It was like this side deal. Okay, let's get the Constitution in, and then we're going to amend it. We have these 10 amendments. Well, why didn't you just put it in? Yeah. Because they were passed immediately. But those individual rights protections, those specific things that are the natural law theory that you have, the government's not giving you. It's just we're putting it in our Constitution to protect those things you have. We had a lot more individual right than the Greeks did because the mob could take away anything and everything no matter what. They just decide. Yeah,
because that's the difference we mentioned last week too. It's like, because the Greeks thought they were completely free because everybody could participate in politics.
Correct.
We are completely free because we have the freedom to not participate in politics. Correct. We do not have to, listen to the government for everything that we have to do.
Right. It's a negative right.
Yes.
You can't come anywhere near me. You have to stay off my property. I have a right to property. You can't seize it without a process and without compensation. I mean, there's all sorts of those kind of restrictions on the government being able to do anything.
It makes me wonder, like, if
they had those protections,
if the assembly had like a Bill of Rights, how much differently would it have functioned? Would it have been more successful? Would it have been more cohesive and stuff like that?
So certainly would have, and they also needed our system set up to make it difficult to make decisions quickly, unless it's a true emergency. Bam, we got to do it, and then you can rush it through because everybody's going to agree, right?
Yeah.
It's a true emergency. Everybody's going to say, okay, let's, but the supermajority, the Senate's set up to be deliberative. You have the House, the Senate, you have the president. You can veto stuff and goes back, and supermajorities have to overturn. So you wouldn't have a decision that is going to be reversed
wouldn't have
the
the
next
two
day.
fleets.
The two fleets going out. Because it takes too long, and the cooler heads prevail. Because any one of us,
because we have the time built into our system to think about all the options,
right,
and think about the consequences.
Correct, right. It forces you, it forces you to listen to somebody else. It's like, oh man, he had a point. Maybe I should do something different than murdering every man of military age in that city and enslaving all the women and children. Maybe I wouldn't do that tomorrow. I wake up in the morning. What the hell did I do yesterday? Let's get another team out there and get the really fast guys this time. And good, it would have been an interesting story if they didn't get there in time.
Yeah,
or maybe they get out there right in the middle of the slaughter. Because it could have happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're a day late. What's with all the blood?
Well, didn't you hear? The assembly changed their minds.
Yes.
They decided not to kill everybody in this city.
Damn it.
Wow, no going back
My
now.
arm is so sore from wielding
killing
that
people.
sword
Yeah.
and cutting off heads. God.
Yikes. Yes, any other thoughts?
But bonus, we have all these slaves. Well, they're not slaves anymore. Wait, how does that work?
Yeah.
I don't know. I have no other thoughts.
You have no other thoughts.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to reading the rest of this. It's very easy read.
Yes.
Very, very quick, very informative as well.
Yeah, you really can plow through it real fast, so it's good.
It is very good.
It's not like work.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Well, this has been Season 4, Episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. You can follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. We got to think of a T-shirt that we're going to give away for Season 3 and 4, a combined T-shirt. So we'll be thinking about that. We'll do some sort of giveaway, I'm sure.
Have to have a contest.
Have to have a contest, yes. So we'll be thinking about that.
There's reviews on our podcast, like on Apple.
Yeah,
podcasts.
I've seen those, which is...
I was telling a friend
Shouldn't
of mine.
be as much of a surprise. I mean, we've been doing this for pretty close to 2 years now. Eventually, we'll get some sort of reviews.
But it was more than one person.
Oh,
I think there were 2 reviews. So
really?
So evidently, I have to use the plural when I discuss our listener.
Had they written something?
Yeah, evidently. I haven't actually seen it. I was telling a friend about it and about this podcast. And he said, I didn't know you did that. I said, yeah. And I said, he says, well, can I access it? I said, yeah, pull it up on Apple Podcasts or whatever. And he says, oh, there's reviews. I said, there's reviews? So I haven't even read them yet. And I think
I've seen one of them.
That was a week ago.
I don't know that we had more.
I think, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, maybe there's just one. Maybe there's just one. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we could give a T-shirt to everybody who reviews us
maybe.
positively. No. Any review.
Okay.
Maybe. I'm not saying it. Maybe we can see how many reviews.
I don't think you're supposed to bribe people into reviewing. I think that's like reason to get kicked off of podcast platforms. I think so. You're not supposed to buy reviews.
Well, we wouldn't really be buying them. They'd be reviewing, and then we send them a T-shirt. Especially if we say review it good or bad.
Oh, I guess that's true. That is true.
But or we could have the best review gets a T-shirt.
Yeah,
like the funniest or something.
Yeah. I think those do help, get you higher up in search results and stuff.
I'm sure it is, because if nobody's reviewing you, really.
Yeah, so make sure to leave us a review. You better get on that, and we'll see about maybe a contest for best review.
Don't you think?
I think that'd be a good idea. That'd be a good idea. Yeah.
But you can't be a multi-season winner, because I suspect that maybe a winner previously.
I think one of our previous winners was one of the reviews. Yes. Yes. All right. Well, this has been Season 4, Episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
Yes, as always.
And forever.
That was a good episode.
Yes.
Hour and 13 minutes.
That's too long.